Hello everyone, I'm Brian Easton, the author of the autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series. Welcome to Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. It's good to be back at the Werewolf Bar after being away for a couple of months. There are some exciting things in the works in our werewolf hunting world, and we're going to talk about those, but not before we get to our creature of the night. This is Ezra Brooks, 99 proof, and it's a familiar bourbon here around the Werewolf Bar. We may have even featured it as the creature of the night before, I don't recall. But in any case, this Kentucky Sour Mash is one of my favorite go-to whiskeys. Great by itself or with a mixer. And to you. It's hard to go wrong with Ezra 99. Well, if you've been following us, at least for the last couple of shows anyway, you know that we've got two books in the offings. Our first and most imminent offering is the Winter Fox Journals Book 2, which is in the hands of Permuted Press right now. Now, we were hoping to get that to you this month, but now it looks like we're tentatively slated for a late summer or even an early autumn release. And that's just how these things go sometimes. But this one is going to follow a young Michael Winterfox into the trenches of the First World War, where he will contend with not only the Beast and not only the Kaiser. Here's a quick preview of the cover art, followed by some early feedback on the book. So this will be Michael Winterfox as no one has seen him yet. Not the gruff old shaman from the original series, and not the fearless youngster from the first Winterfox journals. If you've been looking forward to seeing Michael Winterfox as a young fighting man, hip deep in what was then considered the war to end all wars, then I don't think you're going to be disappointed in the next volume of his journals. And as if that wasn't exciting enough, the second book that I mentioned, Miles Booth and I announced last month. It is the second installment of the Legends of the Werewolf Hunter anthology. For the benefit of those who don't know what that's about, a couple of years ago, MB Press and I got together with a slate of specifically invited authors to bring you what are essentially spin-off tales from the world of autobiography of a werewolf hunter, or the Sylvesterverse, as I like to call it. Since then, it's consistently garnered 4- and 5-star reviews, and with a recurring theme in those reviews, I might add, that the writers seemed to think it achieved a certain coherency that made the disparate stories from different authors come off as if it was all told by one voice, which is a pretty neat thing. Truth be told, we all just had so much fun the last time around, we decided to do it again. Our roster has changed a bit since last time, with some new authors coming aboard to replace others, but also some returning familiar faces. I want you to take a look now at the lineup along with our proposed cover art for The Legends of the Werewolf Hunter, Book 2. So we're really looking forward to putting this together for you and enjoying the road ahead. Now, don't look for that one anytime soon. We're giving our authors plenty of time and room to stretch their legs with this one. And so now we're kind of eyeing February of next year as a kind of a tentative target date. Something to look forward to in the dead of winter 2024. We also have a third project that we're going to see if we can't get off the ground. It's actually an attempt to resurrect the graphic novel that never quite came together several years ago. If you follow our Facebook page, you'll remember that Douglas Adams, who is the lead artist of the project, recently signals his interest to reviving it after some enthusiastic feedback that he received from me posting a few sketches that he'd completed back in the 20-teens. Here's a look at a few random pages and a couple of finished sketches, and mostly rough sketches, that Doug did for the project. Take a look. And there are many, many more. Are you intrigued? I am, but that's all I'm going to say about it now, except that if you subscribe to the channel and follow us on Facebook, you'll be sure to be kept apprised on this and other werewolf hunting related developments. So due to circumstances beyond their control, Tex and Amanda aren't available for this episode. You know how life goes, especially it seems during the summer months and then around the holidays. We appreciate Amanda asks and Tex's tools of the trade, as they're a regular part of our show, and though we miss them when they're not available, we look all that much forward to seeing them when they are. The doctor, however, is in. Dr. T. Bersard from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a maestro of the occult arts and sciences, a subject that factors heavily into my book series. And for that reason, we regularly call on Doc to share his insights with us on those paranormal or supernatural aspects present in the life and times of Sylvester and Michael Winterfox. Tonight, he's back with us after a couple of months hiatus to finish up a discussion of ghosts and spirits, and with one particular entity you'll be sure to recognize. We call this segment Doc Talk Shop with Dr. T. Bersard.
Hello and welcome to Doc Talk Shop as part of Whiskey with the Werewolf. Tonight we are talking about a very special subject in my heart, and the use of the word heart is both ironic and purposeful. Tonight's topic is on the Wendigo. I may have mentioned the Wendigo when discussing things such as skinwalkers or other topics in this series, but this episode is all about the Wendigo itself. First, let's talk about where the Wendigo is from and some of the more intricate details of its folklore and mythology. Note, folklore and mythology are not the same thing. The Wendigo is generally thought to be a product of the Algonquin people primarily. It's generally a North American phenomena, and the mythology goes something like this. An individual is hungry, it's the winter, they go depressed, they are on the verge of actual starvation, they resort to cannibalism, and the act of cannibalism leads them to be possessed by a Wendigo spirit, and then they undergo a transformation in which they are essentially undead and go from being a human cannibal to being a Wendigo, which gives them a heart of ice, magical or mystical powers, and prolonged life as long as they're able to get a hold of human meat. It's important to note that while the Wendigo phenomena begins from the act of cannibalism, once the transformation is made, the individual cannot be thought of as a cannibal because a cannibal is one that eats its own, and a Wendigo, once it makes the transition, is preying on humans when it itself is not a human. Now, all that being said, there are a number of tales as to how this is the memory of warrior shamanism gone wrong, and how this is a memory of bad times when people would have to resort to cannibalism to live. But again, a lot of that is tales heard by whites and sort of as understood by whites in Algonquin cultures, tribal culture. What we now think of as a Wendigo is seen as a truly adversarial spirit. In the case of Sylvester Logan from Whiskey, from Diary of a Werewolf Hunter, we have the case of Old Sly being in a vulnerable position, seething with his own hatred, his own self-loathing, in fact, and being in the right native blood, so that when the particular Wendigo comes along, melds with his hatred and partially possesses him. I say partially because if it were the full deal, he would have actually engaged in the cannibalistic act, and once you go there, the pact is made, and he is a Wendigo. Now, interesting side note, one of the terms for a Wendigo in Canadian tribal areas is Rougarou. Rougarou. Now, that's important because when the Cajuns, my ancestors, came into contact with those tribes, their idea of a Rougarou melded with the Cajun idea of a Rupgarou, and so the Rougarou was born Rougarou. Now, the interesting thing about that is, if you break down the melded term, you actually get the term red or bloodied werewolf out of that term, which goes to prove an idea of mine that the Rougarou is less a werewolf than a vampire. It's kind of undead. But digression over with, it's important to say that in spite of modern media's attempts to meld the two ideas, a Wendigo is not a Native American werewolf at all. There are other Native American things that would be closer to a werewolf than a Wendigo. A Wendigo is, in fact, by nature, a vampiric spirit, which would go back to the struggle between the Wendigo and the werewolf in Diary of a Werewolf Hunter. Now, being a Wendigo does prolong the life of a human far beyond human limits. They don't age. Their outer shell does decay with time, of course, but the spirit remains vital as long as it's able to eat. They are vulnerable to particular metals. The metal depends on the tribe involved. They're also vulnerable to fire, being creatures of cold and ice. Now, there is an element of the Wendigo being selfish and surviving at all costs, which puts it at odds with the idea of a tribal culture from which the Wendigo comes. Now, I'm using the term Wendigo because some of the more actual native terms, one, I can't pronounce them properly, and two, to use those terms could possibly evoke, at the very least, the energies of those creatures, and I don't want to deal with that. So as superstitious as it might seem, I'm sticking to terms that have been so generalized that they don't have any power to them. That's another important thing, much like the Navajo witch and other examples of Native American folklore. To even speak of these things can invite disaster. And again, as a morality example, the Wendigo goes against the tribal concept, is against the humanity is against the idea of being one of the people. It chooses itself over the tribe, which is dangerous if you're a tribal culture. Now, in recent years, there's been an attempt to cast the Wendigo creature as a shapeshifter, as it is to a point, but it does not become healthy examples of the creatures it mimics. It mimics animal noises, animal tracks, animal aspects. It might have a a raven's talon for the bear's teeth, for example. But in any case, all of these things will be represented as decayed, sick, or otherwise, because those things are of nature, and the Wendigo creature is not of nature, it's of the other side. Now, in my travels, and I did spend a good number of years learning among several tribal cultures in North America and South America. There are rituals for both dealing with these spirits, and in one case I am familiar with, for summoning and controlling these spirits. But those rituals to do so, one runs the risk of becoming possessed and being transformed oneself, so that they are not recommended to even be spoken of beyond what I've said. Although I do record some notes on this type of thing in my book, The Path of the Heart of Scars, which is available from Lulu Press if one is interested. The phenomena of the Wendigo is a recorded phenomena. There are documented cases from Canada all the way to New Orleans of this phenomena. The case in New Orleans took place after Katrina. There was a young man who chose to stay when others had left. He stayed with his girlfriend. It's important to note that they were both involved with substance abuse and other risky behaviors, and the isolation and depression brought on by Katrina, coupled with the substance abuse, is what likely led to the young woman's murder and her actually being consumed by the young man. You'll note I do not give the names, although one can look this up online if one chooses, out of respect for the dead. In this case, it's rare because this was not a native person, but it does have all the criteria for a Wendigo possession. The more famous documented native case involves a man named Reindeer who was convicted of consuming his family and was basically diagnosed as having Wendigo syndrome. Now, one might think that there are a lot of complicated rituals for avoiding this kind of thing, but it's actually very simple. To avoid becoming a Wendigo, one must purge oneself of hatred. One must see that one has enough resources in one's life, but not too much. One must maintain one's contact with one's family, and above all, one must build up one's spirit to avoid being possessed by outside spirits, such as the kind that produces a Wendigo possession. On the subject of possession, and our boy Sylvester, during his quasi-possessed state, he faced off against a man while in prison that was possessed by an Eshu spirit. An Eshu spirit is a trickster spirit, literally a spirit of the crossroads, known to pass like Wambanda, as well as Macombe or Candomblé in South America, Mexico, and places like that. This type of spirit is similar to Wendigo in that some possessions can be involuntary, but in the case of the knife fighter Sylvester faced off against, the man was clearly a devotee of the spirits and the possession was voluntary. But the kinds of boons granted were similar. Enhanced strength, enhanced endurance, enhanced speed, longevity, and so forth. And I think that Sylvester had been fully empowered by the Wendigo. He wasn't fighting it. They would have been a very even match. You know, in either case, you're dealing with predatory spirits. You know, the Wendigo is more about power and fear, whereas the Eshu is more about reversal of fortune, trickery, not so much overt violence. In many cases, in America, I can think of examples that are, in fact, as violent as the Wendigo, but I don't, that's another video entirely. But again, the Wendigo represents hatred become hunger, insatiable. It is a bottomless pit, like vengeance itself. It cannot be satisfied. The Wendigo even feeds upon itself, which accounts for some of the physical features those possessed by the Wendigo will acquire. You know, they will chew off the skin of their own fingers and their own lips and things like that. They are, you know, there's never enough. You know, it is one of the most violent forms of self-entitlement that I personally can conceive of, because this is survival at the cost of everything else. At which point you have to ask yourself, how is survival enough to validate that existence? Because it's not a pleasant existence. One is not exalted through Wendigo. It is a state of constant pain, constant want. It is similar in symptoms to that of heroin or other types of substance addiction. It is not simply killing or feeding to live. It is existing in order to feed. It is insatiable. And ultimately, the physical vessel burns out, and all that remains is the spirit form of the Wendigo. And as the cycle gets perpetuated, you know, it becomes a full spirit, it finds another host, and so on and so forth. It takes a very powerful medicine man to unseat the Wendigo. And one of the things that I will mention is that while Sylvester does not see himself has a great spiritual depth of any kind and often decries his own lack in the spirit world. The very fact that Sylvester was able to come back from the quasi position at all proves that with enough time, patience, and training, Sylvester would have made a great medicine man. He holds himself back from it for lots of reasons, but it boils down to the fact of him not believing in himself. That kind of self-loathing, that kind of self-decrying is part of what made him vulnerable to the possession of the first place. Now, one thing I will mention is that in one of the books, Sylvester, in his more rampant stage of the possession, encounters what I can only assume is a kind of datura with wasps and things involved. And I'm not sure if Brian is aware of this or not, but there is a connection between that plant, that insect, and some of the rituals involving Wendigo. I will mention that only as an aside because I will go more depth into it. But this is one of the more dangerous realities that Brian deals with in his books. I say realities because there are documented cases of it in modern times. There are court records of it. It is a phenomena that cannot be discounted simply because it is dealt with in mythic or poetic terms. Because whether one looks at it psychologically, culturally, spiritually, or criminally, the point is that these things do happen. They are known. They're recorded. And while a person in this state may not sprout antlers or grow claws, the bodies attributed to this phenomena can be seen in graveyards. You know, they fill burial plots. So where there is a body, there is some reality. Now, the more metaphysical part of this may only be in the mind of the person going through the experience, but the point is that the results of that phenomena are not in the mind. They are very much on the stage of the world. And so I would caution anyone looking into this stuff, don't go by what you see in the movies or TV. There is nothing empowering about this. There is nothing glamorous about this. These are ugly, ugly spirits that represent some of the most primal urges of life turned rabid. And there is nothing cute or friendly or politically correct, for that matter, about these beings, no matter what popular culture tries to say. And there's no way to really rehabilitate these beings once they've crossed a certain threshold, because they're not part of the normative food chain. They're not part of the tribe. They're not part of humanity. They belong to an order of predatory spirits. I mean, the kinds of isolation and desperation connected to these spirits, they represent a bereavement of the soul. They represent an obsession with lack, which may or may not be actual lack, but the internalized manifestation of it is enough. This is the result of loss of hope. This is the result of not being able to see beyond one's momentary hungers. Now, one must make a distinction between this phenomena and acts resorted to by people in desperate situations in which there were no further acts once those desperate circumstances were dealt with. For example, sailors at sea have been known to resort to cannibalistic acts and afterward were found guilty and, by all accounts, regretted their entire life. They had to eat or starve. What makes the Wendigo different is that once they start, they don't stop. So, on that cheerful note, I will say, be sure you always have enough to eat. Beware of fearing lack, and always mind the moon.
So the Wendigo, that spirit or Manitou of starvation, stress, storm, he embodies everything the Algonquin tribes consider evil, especially personified in its self-serving nature over the needs of the tribe, as Doc specifically pointed out. Now, if you're of a certain age, your first exposure to this being, the Wendigo, might be from Marvel Comics from the 1970s, and the white-furred monster who fought the Incredible Hulk during the first appearance of Wolverine. You might even know about it from the pen of Algernon Blackwood and his novella, The Wendigo, circa 1910. The younger generations will no doubt recall incarnations of Wendigo from television and movies. Charmed and Supernatural come to mind. Ravenous as a movie, to name one. And as supernatural beastie, the Wendigo has infiltrated popular culture by this time. And almost everyone has heard about it. Unfortunately, as is the case with many things pertaining to the occult, we are, for the most part, grossly misinformed as to the nature of this harbinger of hunger, sickness, and decay. And that's why I want to thank Doc with an extra special thank you for tonight's presentation. The Wendigo, as my readers are well aware, is a predominant figure in the second book, Heart of Scars, and later in the first Winter Fox journals, as it obsesses Sylvester to the point of cannibalism in Heart of Scars. But Sly does not succumb. He never actually consumes the human flesh while he is occupied by the spirit. He is later, we find out, diagnosed with Wendigo psychosis, which is the medical term for what is called a culture-bound syndrome, occurring among the Algonquin peoples. But as Doc pointed out, in his reference to the case post-Katrina in New Orleans, there are incidents of this condition jumping lanes, so to speak. Could this be due to the saturation of Wendigo-themed information, regardless of how misguided or erroneous it is? It is, as Doc said, a matter of it getting the spirit's attention or appealing to its ego, as the case with many a dangerous spirit? Or does it all lie in the substance abuse and the general negative drain of the people in question? Among the First Nations, the general cure for someone who had gone Wendigo was death. And only in very rare instances were people who worked for the sacred capable enough to displace the spirit once it had tasted human flesh through its host. Winter fox performs such a feat as a young man, causes great suffering for both himself and for SLJ in the doing. No glory there, only debasement. Thanks again to Dr. Bersard for sharing his words of wisdom with us this evening. Well, last call before we wrap things up for another round. I'm going to have another taste of Ezra 99 and show you something you might not have seen unless you are following my current Facebook page. Now, if you think you are following my current Facebook page, you might want to double check, because the original page was lost back in December of last year. So if you've not seen anything new from me since then, you're probably following a zombie page that I have no control over and don't update and can't update. So keeping that in mind, here are some images I posted back in March of this year. A look at artificial intelligence's, or AI's, interpretation of the 6 beast princes, or sons of Esau in birth order. Here they are. Now, I know there are all kinds of opinions about AI, and I'm conflicted myself because, it won't be long, if it's not here already, when computers not only render better artwork than most of us, but write better stories too. So as much as I admire what AI can do, I'd be lying if I say it doesn't scare me, for more reason than one. But be that as it may, I hope you liked that little presentation there. Hey, thanks for stopping by the Werewolf Bar tonight. You can find me on the web at werewolfhunter.com. If you want to, you can drop me a line at brian@werewolfhunter.com. I hope you're having a great summer wherever you are, staying safe. We'll catch up with you next month during the dog days of August. But until then, thanks for liking and subscribing. Happy hunting, and mind the moon.